or die. I keep boys by my side. CJ Ike, now I gotta roll with ice. Cold, these brothers my guys. Know that they fly, know that they ride or die. I keep boys by my side. CJ Ike, now I gotta roll with ice. Ride or die, 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 ride or die. Cold, these brothers my guys. Know that they fly, know that they ride or die. I keep boys by my side. CJ Ike, now I gotta ride or die.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Tonight is an extra special night. We are going to talk about preemptive kidney transplants tonight until the cows come home. Our guest tonight is Dr. Elliot Heher. He is a kidney transplant nephrologist. He did his undergraduate work at Harvard College, attended Harvard Medical School, did his residency training at Osler Medical Service at Johns Hopkins Hospital. He was a Robert Woods Johnson Clinical Scholar at the University of Pennsylvania and the Wharton School before becoming the medical director at Aetna. He left Aetna to co-found and serve as the chief medical officer of HTH Worldwide, now known as GeoBlue, which offers comprehensive healthcare plans for employers who travel, study, or work internationally. After fellowship training in nephrology, Elliot joined the staff at Massachusetts General Hospital as a nephrologist and transplant nephrologist. In 2014, he was named the medical director of the kidney transplant program there. Under Dr. Elliott's watch, the kidney transplant program at Massachusetts General doubled in size to record numbers, placing the program in the top 50 national programs for the first time in their history, also lowering the length of stay, readmission rates, improving clinical outcomes, and scores from national transport regulatory agencies. While at Massachusetts General, he won or was nominated for several awards, including the Nathaniel Bowditch Award for Quality Improvement and Cost Reduction, the Brian A. McGovern Award for Clinical Excellence, Renal Physician of the Year, Samuel Tier for Excellence in Teaching, and others. He was a Boston Magazine Best Doctor in 2019. When the famous Boston City Councilor John Nucci received his kidney transplant in June of 2018, Dr. Heher was the director of kidney transplantation at Massachusetts General Hospital. In 2020, he founded a new and exciting healthcare company called Square Knot Health. Square, full word KNOT Health Inc. Square Knot offers a new approach to chronic kidney disease management through a transplant-first philosophy, aiming to increase living donor transplant while employing the goal of future transplant to empower patients with kidney failure to achieve better health. Square Knot expands access to transplantation for transplant and donor candidates through education, pre-evaluation, mentoring, by deploying navigators who have a personal connection to kidney transplantation, and with telehealth and other technologies. He is an outspoken supporter of preemptive kidney transplants. Please welcome Dr. Elliot Heher to the show. Start the show, Steve. Doc, how are you?
I'm well, thanks, Jim. It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on with us. Let's get right into it. Did I state your credentials, your educational experience, your employment correctly in my introduction?
You did. It was very flattering. Thank you for being so thorough. And let me just add that the success we had growing the program at Mass General was the work of a lot of people. And I happened to be the medical director at the time, but was it a team effort.
Your team.
Thank you.
Talk to me a little bit about what a transplant nephrologist is, what it is that you do and why it's unique.
Sure. Transplant nephrology is a subspecialty of nephrology. So every transplant nephrologist is first an internal medicine doctor and then a nephrologist. So they do extra fellowship training in nephrology and learn how to diagnose and manage kidney disease and learn how to perform and manage dialysis. But then those who are interested in transplantation do additional training to learn about kidney transplantation, how patients qualify for transplant, how they are managed at the time of the transplant, and how they're managed after. In particular, transplant nephrologists gain a lot of expertise in the management of the anti-rejection drugs, the immunosuppression, and in the diagnosis and prevention of complications of transplant.
Okay. Talk to us about your feeling on the issue of transplant versus dialysis. What should be the first option, particularly for those patients that are possibly facing kidney failure?
Yeah, it's amazing, Jim. So I did my residency training at Hopkins in the early 1990s. And at the time, it really seemed like a toss-up between dialysis and transplant. I recall quite well when I was a medical student in the late 80s, so a few years before that, patients having significant rejection of transplants being treated with a drug called OKT3, for example, which was a mouse protein, basically, that antibody that caused a severe reaction to almost everyone that got it. And the outcomes weren't where they really needed to be. And it seemed like a toss-up between transplant and dialysis. Boy, what a difference the last 30 years have made. It's been so gratifying and so wonderful to be able to practice medicine and practice nephrology in this era, because kidney transplantation has just improved dramatically. And at a time that dialysis has pretty much stayed the same. There has certainly been some improvements, and certainly there's an extraordinary number of dedicated professionals who are working hard to make dialysis better. And there's an extraordinary number of patients on dialysis who live with amazing and admirable grace and courage on dialysis. But the technological improvements in transplantation during that period have been extraordinary. And they really fit into a few categories. First of all, the surgical techniques. No surgeon, but my colleagues, surgical colleagues whom I have utmost respect, are now able to take kidneys out of living donors using a laparoscopic technique. And the technique of putting them in recipients has gotten very, very refined and very sophisticated, such that patients are often leaving the hospital 3 days after a kidney transplant. So that's number one. Number two is the advancements in immunosuppression. The introduction of cyclosporin in the early 1980s, around 1984, was a huge step forward and took 1 year patient or 1 year transplant survivals from about 50% at 1 year up to 70%, just the introduction of that one drug. But with other incremental changes in immunosuppression efficacy since the early 1980s. We're now up to well above 95%, and with living donor kidneys, almost 99% of those kidneys will still be working at 1 year. Rejections, when diagnosed, can almost always be managed. So there's been a huge improvement in the efficacy and the safety and the tolerability, how well patients feel on immunosuppression drugs. I've got a former patient of mine was my insurance agent for years, and I had no idea that he had a kidney transplant. He wasn't my patient yet. You can't tell that patients with kidney transplants have them. In many cases, the drugs cause no noticeable side effects. Patients look, act, and feel normal, and that's been an improvement since the 80s. And then the last thing is better ability to diagnose, prevent, and treat infections. So to give you one example, cytomegalovirus, abbreviated as CMV, was a real scourge for transplant in the 80s and even into the 90s. To treat it, immunosuppression had to be reduced so that the immune system could fight the virus, because there were no drugs available that might have worked against the virus, but then invariably a rejection intervened. A patient developed antibodies to their kidney that could never really be eliminated. It was a real scourge. Now we have intravenous drugs. Even better, we have an oral drug that is really effective at reducing the chances of getting CMV after transplant. And if you do get CMV, it can treat many, if not most, of the cases. So those have been sort of the 3 steps forward that have made the transplant relative to dialysis a clear option in the last 20, 30 years.
Okay. Would it be fair for me to say that preemptive transplant is the best therapy and should be considered first before dialysis?
Absolutely. And one of my frustrations, and one of the reasons that I left my work at Mass General, as much as I enjoyed it, and left to form this new entity, Square Knot Health, is because despite all those improvements in transplant and the advantages of transplant relative to dialysis, we were still seeing patients who had already started dialysis or already been on dialysis for some years. That's when we were still seeing them for the first time. And yet we know from the data that patients who receive a kidney transplant before any dialysis is necessary do better. The kidneys last longer, the patients live longer. Even as much as, or as little as 6 to 12 months of dialysis can impact survival after transplant in a way, in a negative fashion. So I'm a big fan of preemptive kidney transplant. It also, there are a lot of advantages that relate. People sort of think of as quality of life, but I would think I think that's too narrow a definition. There are really advantages that relate to people's life. So let me give you an example. With a preemptive kidney transplant, which is almost always a living donor transplant, the transplant can be scheduled. Family members can come in from out of town to stay with small children. The children can be told in advance, this transplant's going to happen. Your father, your mother has to go in the hospital for a few days. Everything can be planned and much more acceptable. The patient's work can be notified. I'm going to have a kidney transplant. I'm going to be out of the office for a couple of months. I look forward to seeing you and feeling better when I'm back. I may be checking emails, after a month or two. Wish me luck. It's an extraordinary advantage to turn a transplant into a planned procedure. And of course, since preemptive transplants, again, are mostly living transplants, those kidneys from living donors tend to work sooner. They almost always work immediately. They tend to work better, and they tend to work longer. They last longer. So a preemptive transplant from a living donor is fabulous. Now, a preemptive transplant from a deceased donor is also fabulous. It's just a little bit harder to get. It usually involves a little bit of luck, but you can increase the chance of getting it by getting listed early, because if you're not on the list, of course, you won't be offered a deceased donor kidney at any time. But also, the earlier you're listed, the more waiting time you have, and the more likely you are to be competitive for a kidney that comes up even before you've started dialysis.
Okay. Our good friend Amanda Granatelli is on, and she's asking, why do hospital systems tell their patients all the time that you need to go on dialysis first before you're eligible for a transplant?
That's yeah, man. Great. Thanks for the question, and it's a great question. I think my guess is that most transplant centers these days aren't delivering that message. It's a shame that anyone's delivering that message. I think there are a couple of disease states where there's the belief that some period of time on dialysis will quiet the disease state and make it less likely that that disease will return in the transplanted kidney. So on very rare occasions, there's a medical rationale for it. But I think it's an example of how sometimes news travels shockingly slow in medicine. Sometimes medicine's at the cutting edge of things. Certainly think about how much has been learned and how much is being done about COVID-19 over the last 18 months. On the other hand, sometimes there are facts, like the fact that transplant performed before and without any dialysis is far better than a period of dialysis. There are facts like that just don't seem to disseminate as quickly as we like, and I can't really explain it. In terms of the transplant center, the other issue, and this is something that I think it's going to be critical for us, for the healthcare system to address, and we sure hope that Square Knot Health is a part of the solution, is that transplant centers are struggling to meet the volume of patients who need to be evaluated, and the volume of donors who need to be evaluated to be potential living donors. So let me throw out some numbers. In any given year in the United States, we estimate there are about 400,000 patients entering chronic kidney disease stage 4. Now that's a critical stage because at that stage, every guideline for the management of chronic kidney disease from national authorities and international authorities like KDIGO, recommend that at stage 4, you begin to plan, the patient and his or her doctors begin to plan for the possibility of kidney failure, and in particular plan for the possibility of transplant in addition to other alternatives. So then you have 400,000 people then every year who need education and at least some assessment about their transplant candidacy. But to tell someone you're a candidate for transplant and then not to go the next step and say, who might be able to give you a kidney? Is there anyone in your friend group or your family that might be interested in giving you a kidney? And let's talk about their candidacy. Do they need to lose 5 or 10 pounds? Do they need to go and have a physical exam with their doctor? What do we need to do so that they can be eligible to donate a kidney? Maybe they need to quit smoking, et cetera. So in any given year, we have the 400,000 patients who might need a kidney soon. And then we have all the potential live donors. So for the sake of argument, let's say that on average, every recipient could identify 1 or 2 live donor candidates. Now, we know that some won't be able to identify any and may need some help or may need a non-directed donor, a so-called altruistic donor to step up. But we also know that other people will identify 4 or 5. I spoke with a patient earlier today who'd had 20 people present for him to offer him a kidney. Really extraordinary. So let's, for the sake of argument, say it's 1 or 2. Well, that means there's about anywhere between 800,000 and 1.2 million people every year, new people in the United States, who require transplant or donor education and assessment or evaluation. Well, there are only 200, approximately just over 200 adult kidney transplant centers in the United States. All told, there's about 230 if you include the pediatric centers and the Veterans Administration centers. And working in those centers, by my estimate and the estimate of some colleagues, I wrote about this issue in the the Journal of the American Transplant Society, American Society of Transplantation. There are about 750 to 1,000 transplant nephrologists in the United States, and probably a similar number of transplant coordinators. So you've got somewhere between about 1 million people, round numbers, to be serviced in 200 places by 750 doctors and 750 coordinators who, let's face it, are very busy doing other things as well. Because in addition to evaluating patients for their eligibility or other patients for their eligibility to donate, transplant nephrologists are taking care of patients who have kidney transplants. Some are in the hospital, some are in the outpatient setting, and they need their immunosuppression, their medicines adjusted, et cetera. So you get this sense for what there's this massive disconnect between supply and demand. And so transplant centers often create rules that prevent patients from getting early assessment and education and prevent donors. I think it's because they're often trying to protect their own volume. Their coordinators are busy, in some cases overwhelmed. And so transplant centers will say things like, well, we won't see you until your GFR is 20, or maybe they'll say 25. Well, all the guidelines say you should begin to plan for kidney failure when your GFR hits 30. And so then you lose another 5 or 10 points before you can sit down and have a serious discussion with someone about transplant. And that's a missed opportunity right there. That's 5 to 10 points of GFR. In some patients, that's years. Other patients progress quite quickly, but in some cases, that's years that could be spent searching for a donor, getting yourself in better shape for transplant, getting your head around the issue, the emotional challenges of it. So that's a really missed opportunity. Then transplant centers will say, well, we won't see any donors until the recipient is listed for kidney. Well, sir, it sort of makes some logical sense to be efficient. Yeah, why should we spend our time? Why should they spend their time with donors, if the recipient might not ever qualify? That would be kind of a quote unquote waste of time, if we invested in donors on behalf of a recipient who won't qualify. Well, here's why: because it takes much longer than anyone would like to admit to get a donor evaluated. And because sometimes donors themselves face barriers, as I mentioned a minute or two ago, that they themselves need to address. So they need some primary care, they need some preventive maintenance care, they need their colonoscopy, they need to quit smoking, they need to lose a little weight. They need all those things, and they need advice about that. So the system needs to be easier for living donor candidates to get education and assessment and evaluation, so they can either know that they really are moving towards being a donor, or that they have some barriers that need to be addressed. And then the third thing is transplant centers will often say, we're only going to evaluate one donor at a time, or maybe two. And many people on the call may have encountered this. Well, think about that patient I mentioned earlier who had 20 people call for him to offer him a kidney. So that's going to take some months to find which one of the 20 would be qualified. But to work through them one at a time seems imperfect to me. There's some data from Canada that the optimal number is 4. That's they ran some models and they looked purely at it from an economic perspective, of course, it's one perspective. I prefer to look at it from the perspective of human suffering as a physician and trying to minimize human suffering. But even from an economic perspective, in the Canadian system, where dialysis is considerably less expensive than it is in the United States, it still made sense to look at 4 donors simultaneously to reduce the risk of the patient going on dialysis and the attendant costs. Again, that was an economic analysis. From a human suffering point of view, it's a complete no-brainer. So we've got a supply and demand problem in transplant, and that's one of the key things that needs to be addressed, and it's certainly one of the approaches that we're taking at Square Knot Health.
Okay, I'm going to ask, true or false? Should it be a standard practice to advise the prospective kidney failure patient, that preemptive transplant is an option?
Yes, should be the standard practice to tell them that it's the best option. But I do have to say there's a little dilemma here, and here's the dilemma. So, as I mentioned earlier, there are people who've lived and continue to live day to day on dialysis and have done so for years or decades with an extraordinary amount of courage and grace. And some of them live quite well in terms of how they live. Some of them work. Some of them have what would appear completely like transplant patients. You really couldn't tell almost that they're dialysis patients, despite the fact that they're investing in an extraordinary amount of time in it and they're being extremely careful with their diets, et cetera. So we want to go into, for anyone that's starting dialysis, we certainly want them to feel hopeful and optimistic that they can be that kind of person, that they can be successful and happy and productive on dialysis. But the statistics tell us that transplant is a much better option. If you play the odds, you're much more likely to feel well and to live well with a transplant. As Dori Sega from Hopkins has pointed out, at any age, transplant doubles your life expectancy. So we have this dilemma that on the one hand, we know the facts about transplant versus dialysis. And we think that I think that patients with advanced chronic kidney disease should know the facts. We shouldn't be hiding things from them. On the other hand, we don't want to take away the hope and the optimism for someone that ends up needing to go on dialysis for one reason or another, that they can't live well and live long on that therapy as well. So that's the dilemma that we have to solve. And I think, like a lot of things in medicine, it's best to bring patients into, my personal approach is to bring patients into that dilemma, and make sure they understand the difference between statistics and averages on the one hand and individual patient experience on the other. And to say, here are the statistics, here are the averages. And, I like to play the odds. On the other hand, we're going to do what's best for you, and whatever path you end up having to follow, we're going to do everything we can to make sure it's optimized and to make sure you do well on that path. And I'm going to be, and your whole team is going to be with you, and you're going to do great. And so that's sort of my approach, but it is a challenge. And I think it's one of the reasons why some patients don't really know that transplant, and preemptive transplant in particular, is the best way. And some people who work in kidney medicine don't tell patients like that. It's a little bit, remember the movie line, when I think it's Jack Nicholson, someone says to him, I want the truth. And he says, you can't handle the truth. And there's a little bit of that. There's a little bit of fear among some providers, physicians, nurses, et cetera, in the kidney world, that patients can't handle the truth. I don't believe that's true. I believe patients can always handle the truth, and they want the truth, and they deserve the truth. Of course, it has to be delivered in a humane way. And again, it has to balance the statistics, because the statistics aren't the truth. They're just one view of it, with the fact that we never know what's going to happen with any given person. And we know that hopefulness and determination make a huge difference in the individual patient's case. So that's kind of my approach.
Okay. I've heard you tell a story, because it's my understanding that in your experience, you have educated other nephrologists, particularly when they're studying to take the boards, to become board certified. Can you tell us the story about your show of hands and your board certification students when it comes to preemptive transplant?
Yeah, thanks for reminding me. So for several years, I gave a talk at the Brigham and Women's Hospital Nephrology Board Review course. So the Brigham and Women's, a well-known hospital here in Boston. In fact, it was the site of the very first successful kidney transplant in 1954 between two identical twins. So it's a very well-known hospital and a very well-known nephrology and transplant program. So I gave this talk on living donation, and for several years, I started the talk. There's a room full of nephrologists. That's who the audience is. They're all nearing the end of their training, and they're about to take the nephrology boards for the first time. In some cases, they're practicing nephrologists, but they're recertifying. 10 years has passed since the last time they took it, and they have to sit for it again. So they've come to take this review course. And I started out the talk with the following question for them, and asked for a show of hands. If you yourself were looking at the possibility of kidney failure, how would you like it treated? Show of hands. Number one, dialysis for the rest of your life. And never once in the years that I asked that question did a single nephrologist raise their hand. Option two, dialysis for a period of months or years, followed by deceased donor kidney transplant. In 1 year that I asked this question, a single hand went up. There are hundreds of people in the room. In the other years I asked that question, no hand went up. Option number three, preemptive living donor kidney transplantation performed prior to any dialysis being necessary. Every hand in the room went up. And that became then my launch the launch into my discussion about living donation, because to make that a reality, everyone has to be on board with evaluating liver donors. But it really was not a study that could be published, not a so-called scientific study. But after 3 years of asking that question to hundreds of nephrologists, it sure reinforced that that they know, and I think in many cases they would many of them would want more of their patients down a preemptive kidney transplant path.
Okay, we've talked a little bit about the advantages and the disadvantages of preemptive transplant as opposed to dialysis. I've heard you make the statement, the longer you are on dialysis, the more likely the option for transplant will close. Can you explain what you mean by that, please?
Sure. So this goes to the reality of dialysis treatments and what happens from a clinical and a medical point of view to some, but again, not all, to some, many more than we would like, patients on dialysis. So dialysis is associated with significant mortality. 18% or so of patients who start dialysis will die in the first year. More than 50%, 55% or so will die within the first 5 years. A substantial number of patients who are over the age of 65 will develop will lose functional status in the first 6 months that they're on dialysis, meaning if they were walking independently or even working after 6 months of dialysis, they may no longer be able to do the things they were able to do before. Heart disease becomes much more common. Blood vessels become stiff. Cognitive impairment becomes significant. About 20, depending on the study, but at maybe as much as 25 to 30% of the time when someone goes on a hemodialysis machine, one portion of the heart will stop working temporarily during the dialysis procedure. And this results from inadequate blood flow, basically, but it can result in scarring of the heart and cardiomyopathy. So the mortality experience, meaning the fact that patients die more frequently than we would like on dialysis, reflects a number of changes that are happening in their body that build up over time. And sometimes the patient may still be alive and attending dialysis and doing their best, but a contraindication has developed to transplant. Something has happened that now makes transplant no longer an option. So probably the most common relates to cardiac issues. Again, the heart suffers from sometimes inadequate blood flow. The fact that all of the fluid that someone is drinking over the course of the week is removed during 3 sessions. Again, I'm just talking about intermittent hemodialysis now in center. That's a stress on the heart. Those things are tough on the heart, and that's often a reason why patients no longer are candidates for transplant. But another reason, as I mentioned, is that the blood vessels become stiff on patients on dialysis. They become calcified. And to perform a kidney transplant, the surgeons need a place in the upper thigh, kind of in the groin area, to plug the new kidney in. And if the blood vessels in that part of the lower abdomen, upper thigh, are too thick, too calcified, too hard, it's not safe to put the kidney in. The kidney won't get proper blood flow, and the blood vessel may then no longer supply blood to the leg, which can put the leg at risk. So there's a window phenomenon, and patients will sometimes qualify when they start dialysis. They're candidates for transplant, but then over time, they will no longer be candidates for transplant, and the window will close. And that's all of that is rationale not only for preemptive transplant, but also for preemptive listing. Because of course, to get a preemptive transplant, you have to be seen early, and there's a number of advantages to early transplant preparation and early listing for everyone, even for those that can't identify a living donor.
Okay, I've heard you talk about the issue, the argument against preemptive transplant, that there just aren't enough living donors, that there's the availability of living donors is a problem. How do you address this issue? And please explain the importance of starting with the recipient and the subsequent steps to find a living donor early on.
Yeah, so it's a great point, Jim. I think that when you that one fact that there is a quote unquote shortage of kidney donors has become a paralyzing explanation to prevent the field from moving forward. People hear that, even people who don't work in the field, and they sort of, at that point, they sort of go, "Oh well, that's it. That's the end of the story. No, nothing more to be done about that problem because that's an unsolvable problem." I don't believe that that's true, and let me explain why I think that is. The vast majority of living donors are family or friends or acquaintances of the recipients. We certainly have some amazing people, so-called non-direct or altruistic donors who donate kidneys to the list or through a paired kidney exchange to someone they don't know. They do it purely because they read about the need and out of their incredible generosity. But most donors are known to recipients before they donate. So empowering recipients to do a search for a living donor is really critical. But no recipient will ever start searching for a donor until they know two things. Number one, they have to know the advantages of transplant relative to dialysis. They have to get over their fears, their very understandable fears of transplant. It seems like a radical thing, right, to have someone else's organ in you. Many people assume, well, that would be my last option, right? I should try everything else first, when, of course, we know that it should not be the last option. It should be before dialysis. But yet, patients need to be educated, need to work through those fears and begin to embrace transplant as the best choice for them. That's number one. Number two, patients, recipient candidates need to know that they're candidates, that they could receive a kidney transplant. There's a lot of uncertainty in their mind. They've been told by their nephrologist, by various people they've read online, that you have to qualify for transplant, quote unquote. And so if they don't know that, number one, transplant's better, and number two, that they qualify, they're not going to embark on a detailed living donor search. And then, of course, the third thing, once 1 and 2 are taken care of, then they need help on that search. And that's where amazing people like Ken Bressler come in. There's an extraordinary number of volunteers working in the field now who are guiding patients on their donor search and mentoring them through it, encouraging them, teaching them some techniques, and that's certainly important, but also being there as their support person and pumping them up when they get down and helping them keep search. So that, to me, that's the way you expand the living donor pool. Certainly, any efforts to expand to educate potential non-direct or altruistic donors, all in favor of. I think that the steps that have been taken to lower the financial burdens to keep living donors whole economically. The National Living Donor Assistance Center has a larger budget now than they had a couple of years ago. The National Kidney Registry offers a variety of programs to try and reduce the economic burden on non-directed donors. All those things are fabulous. And I think they're really moving the field forward. But I think we've got to really get recipients who are in the driver's seat. We got to get them educated, and we got to get them aware that they're a candidate for transplant. And then we got to help them. And those three things will supercharge the search for living donors and will unlock a lot of donor potential that's out there.
Okay. My good friend Bobby Reed is asking a question that relates to my next question. I've heard you talk about a 1993 New England Journal of Medicine article comparing transplant patients with patients who remained on the waiting list. Well, why is it important to get people transplanted early as opposed to being on the waiting list? And my follow-up question is, do you have to be on the list first if you have a matching donor?
Yeah, great question. So that paper, the first author's name was Wolf. It was in the New England Journal in 1993. What a shot! Like lightning strike. That really was the beginning of the accumulating proof about how transplant had improved relative to dialysis. And before that 1993 paper, if someone said, well, transplant is better than dialysis, the response was often, well, transplant patients are just healthier. So they're doing better than dialysis patients, not because dialysis is a better therapy, but because of the selection process, they're just skimming off the cream and transplanting the cream. And so, of course, those patients would live longer. Well, what made that 1993 paper remarkable is they had a good strategy to sort that. And what they did was they just looked at patients who were on the list for kidney transplant. So these were patients that the transplant centers had determined qualified for transplant. And then they compared the survival of patients who were listed who were actually transplanted to patients who were listed who did not receive a kidney just through the luck or lack of luck in the draw. And that's when they found this really dramatic survival benefit of transplant. And that really became sort of marked the beginning of the era when it was clear that transplant was better. Now, as I said, here we are in 2021, 28 years later, right? And we're still struggling in some cases to get that word out. So that's a little frustrating, but that paper was really extraordinary. The advantages of preemptive transplant are that you avoid all those medical problems that develop on dialysis. And it's hard when I say they develop on dialysis. It may simply be that not so much that dialysis is causing the problem, as that dialysis is an incomplete replacement of kidney function. And so patients on dialysis are getting some toxins removed effectively, but there are other toxins in their blood that are accumulating and over time causing problems. And so that's a major advantage of preemptive transplant, to avoid that toxicity. Now, I should say I've been talking a lot about, when I talk about dialysis, I've mostly been talking about hemodialysis as opposed to peritoneal dialysis, and I've been mostly talking about 3-day-a-week traditional in-center dialysis. There are obviously a number of flavors of dialysis, and many patients who are on home dialysis, particularly home hemodialysis, may dialyze 5 or 6 times a week, or may dialyze 8 hours at a time. And though their outcomes, the more dialysis they do, their outcomes do improve pretty dramatically. And some patients do very well on PD as well. The distinction in the literature between PD and hemodialysis in terms of the benefits has been a little bit harder to tease out. But I didn't want to leave everyone the impression that there's only one type of dialysis, and that the problems associated with intermittent hemodialysis are the same as other types of dialysis. Now, as far as the question about whether you need to be listed, technically you do need to be on the list. That's a federal government. That's a requirement of UNOS, the United Network of Organ Sharing. But you can be placed on the list the day before the transplant. So if you have an approved living kidney donor, and your center, and you haven't been listed yet for whatever reason, because perhaps you came into the center with a donor, and we said, well, I need a kidney, and this is my donor, and you sailed through the process, and your donor sails through the process, and they just haven't gotten around to listing you yet. They can list you the day before the living donor transplant. So it's really it's a requirement only in an administrative sense. There's absolutely no reason from a clinical point of view that a kidney transplant can't be scheduled and performed without the patient being on the list. And you certainly don't need any time on the list, meaning you can have an hour on the list or a minute and get your kidney transplant from a living donor.
Okay, very good, very good. Let's talk about Square Knot Health. Where are you guys located? What it is that you do there, and why did you start it?
Yeah, so I live outside of Boston, but we're going to be a work from anywhere company. And my colleague Julie Hogan, who's our first navigator and is going to lead our navigator program.
She's on the line tonight.
Yeah, indeed. Julie's in Las Vegas. So we're really excited about taking advantage of kind of this new world of work that we never thought, of course, before COVID that we would necessarily get into so quickly. But now that it's happened and the technology has improved, we've begun to see the benefits, I think, in a lot of industries. And in transplant evaluation or transplant medicine, it's clear that what we're lacking are enough people who have the knowledge to educate and assess recipients and donors. And so to limit ourselves to one city, if I'd said, oh, I'm going to start this company in Boston and everyone that works here is going to have to live, it's going to have to come to the office here in Boston and visit, and work together in place like a traditional workplace, I would really have been limiting ourselves in terms of what people can hire. And so it's been incredibly freeing to have to use the technology and the work from anywhere point of view. The other thing is we're one of the solutions. So I talked earlier about this big gap between the demand and the need for transplant education and assessment on the one hand, and the limited supply on the other. How can we solve that problem? And that's what SquareNot is one of the major problems that SquareNot's trying to solve. And one way we're going to do it is with technology, and specifically with telehealth. Telehealth, of course, it sort of rolls off the tongue. It sounds fancy, but it's FaceTime, right? It's FaceTime that we all do with our kids, our grandkids in other parts of the country, right? We've all been doing it, and that was even pre-COVID. So it's a ubiquitous technology. It's one that people are increasingly comfortable with, and yet it can break down those geographic barriers. We know that there are a lot of disparities in transplant they're really unfortunate. Some of those disparities are along racial and ethnic lines. Some of those disparities are geographic. One of our big SquareNot practices that's referring patients to us is a nephrology practice in Bangor, Maine. So that's in northern Maine, 2.5 hours north of Portland. Another one's in Berkshire County, Massachusetts. That's in the western part of the state, really far away from any of the cities. So the nephrologists there want their patients to get transplanted, and yet they know they're having trouble getting them through the system, more trouble than the nephrologists closer to transplant centers are reporting. So we're going to use technology to overcome that barrier, that geographic barrier, and some of the other barriers, really unfortunately inequitable barriers related to race and ethnicity as well. And so it made total sense that if we're going to use technology as a key part of our business, that we'll also use it to structure our employer-employee relationships.
You mentioned some of the people that you work with and some of your navigators. I just want to point out Kent Bressler at Kidney Solutions. He's from Kerrville, Texas. So the use of technology there would be very handy. Kent's been very successful at helping people get preemptive kidney transplants. Very, very successful. And I know the two of you guys are working together. So I just wanted our audience to know that when doctor talks about the long distance things, doctor's not kidding.
Yeah, and Amanda, who you mentioned earlier, Grandinetti, was kind enough to introduce me to Ken, and he does remarkable work. And as I mentioned, there are others working on often a volunteer basis around the country who are mentoring and shepherding patients through transplant evaluations and donor searches, then mentoring donors through. And I have such an extraordinary amount of respect for those individuals. Part of SquareNot's thesis is that if we're going to create a sustainable solution to this problem, and we're really going to grow transplant, let's face it. So that every year about 130,000 people develop kidney failure in the United States. And only 3% of them receive a transplant as their initial therapy. And only about 1% of Black patients do. I mean, those numbers are a disgrace. Of course, the 1%, 3% is a massive inequity and disgrace. But even the 3% as on an absolute basis is terrible. And so if we're really going to create a sustainable solution to that problem and get that, can we make it 80%? Well, that's probably aggressive, but 3%, can't we do 6%, 9%, 12%? We got to do better than that. And I think to do that in a sustainable way, we need a sustainable organization. So we're trying to create out of the navigator position a career. And my hope is that it's our navigator's favorite job ever. Many of them like Julie, we hope to hire people who've had kidney transplants like Julie has, or living donors, or friends or family of people who've been through it, who have knowledge learned the hard way, the school of hard knocks, and have a passion for improving it. And we think that's going to be really important. But we want to make it a career where they come to it with a passion and some knowledge, and we train them, and they continue to learn, and so they're improving as navigators over the course of the year. But they're paid for that work, and they receive benefits, and they do everything that goes along with a career. Because I think that's going to be sustainable. I mean, what we're really competing with Fresenius and DaVita, right? I mean, if we want to have more transplants, we got to have a professional approach to transplant assessment and education and evaluation that will rival the entire dialysis ecosystem. And as much as I love and admire volunteer efforts, volunteerism is absolutely critical to the structure of our society. I think part of SquareNaut's premise is to create a professional alternative that we hope will be a real valid and fearsome, if not fearsome, competitor to the dialysis community.
Okay, we're in the home stretch here, Doc, so I need some quick answers. I've heard you make the statement, finding someone who is healthy and willing to share his kidney is more important than being a match in this day and age. Can you explain that, please?
Yeah, that's correct. So with the modern immunosuppression, the improvements that I referenced earlier over the course of the 20 years, a living donor kidney from almost any donor will work as well as a living donor kidney from almost any other. There are a couple exceptions. If you have a perfectly matched sibling, that's a kidney you really prefer to get. But a kidney from a half-matched sibling, from a child, from a parent, from a spouse, from a friend, from the man on the street, all of those kidneys are expected to last about as long as any other. That's where we are these days with modern immunosuppression and with the advantages of living donor transplant. And that's why you don't have to worry anymore about being biologically related. And then on the issue of match, well, you certainly need blood group compatibility. Some people think if they're blood group A, they need an A donor. Of course, they could have an A donor or an O donor. But with paired kidney exchange, we could swap your A kidney or your A donor's kidney for a B to match you. So that's why this issue of matching is no longer, I think, a word that we really even should be using in discussions with patients. It's certainly something transplant centers have to think a little bit about. And in the case of the sensitized patient who has so-called HLA antibodies, then match becomes more of an issue that the transplant center has to sort out. But at the level of educating patients, potential candidates, potential donors, nephrologists, I think we should talk not about match. We should talk about healthy and willing. Go find someone who's healthy and willing, and let us do our best to see if we can make it work out for a living donor transplant.
Okay, practical question, Doc, that I know is on the mind of many of us that are patients. How does SquareNaut get paid? How are they compensated? And I understand that you're in the grant process. Can you explain how that works?
Yeah, sure. So we're small and starting up, and so we're looking for startup funds. We're looking to supplement our current startup funds through grants or other sources. But we expect those to be sort of one-time kind of contributions or investments to help us build the technology that we think we need to build the infrastructure, to hire a group, the initial group of navigators, and to train them, and to build some of the technology we think is necessary to meet that big gap between demand and supply. How much need we have for education and assessment on the one hand versus the limited supply on the other. We need to fill that gap with navigators and with technology. And so the capital that we're looking for from grants or from other investors relates to those needs. But over the long term, how can we be a self-sustainable enterprise? Because I say we want to develop a professional organization that can compete with the Fresenius and the DaVitas of the world. So one way is by billing claims. So to the extent we have a doctor or a nurse practitioner or another qualified professional providing chronic kidney disease education around the issues of transplant, or providing donor assessment tools in the form of a second opinion, those services can be billed to insurance companies. So we're currently getting referrals from nephrologists. So, think about that. There's some who believe that nephrologists are reluctant to get their patients transplanted. We're getting referrals from nephrologists who are just really excited that there's an option to help their patients through the process. And we are billing those patients as second opinions, essentially. And so far, the feedback we've gotten and the advice we've gotten from billing experts and consultants is that absolutely, you need to be participating with the insurance company, but that's absolutely a suitable way to proceed. So that's one way. And the second way is with direct relationships with insurance companies or with payers. So we are, I can't quite tell you who, because it's not quite done yet, but we're in advanced discussions with a large health plan such that they will use their claims database to identify patients with advanced chronic kidney disease. They'll reach out to those patients in a very careful and scripted way, in a very clinically thoughtful and sensitive way, and ask if these individuals, these members of their health plan, would be interested in speaking to Square Knot about the possibility of transplant. And if they are, those individuals get passed along to us in a secure way, and then we'll take over from there and apply the Square Knot program. So, and in that case, when we enroll such a patient, we get paid a flat fee from the insurance company. And the advantage of the flat fee is, we all know in medicine, it's really hard to set incentives right, because if you pay people to do one thing, you tend to get a lot of that thing, right? There's sort of the natural human tendency to kind of do what you're paid for. And also the rules around billing are so strict that, a doctor can bill this, but a navigator can't, even if the navigator might have done it better than the doctor. Whereas with this case rate type approach, it will give us a lot of flexibility to apply the best person to the job. And if that's a navigator who's been through a kidney transplant himself or herself, or a donor who spends 20 minutes or half an hour on the phone with a potential recipient, talking to them about live donation, et cetera, then, amen, whatever the best approach is. And that's why we're really excited about that case rate approach. And it's, from the health plan side, it's very exciting as well, because it really limits their risk. They're really trying to, they all want to improve the quality of care that their members receive, but dollars are short in healthcare. There's a lot of healthcare inflation. Everyone's trying to fight for a dollar here or there, and so they're interested in programs that might be able to help them do that.
Okay, last question, Doc. Is there anything I forgot to ask you about? Would you like to make any final statements that you feel are important to mention before we conclude our discussion tonight?
Well, I want to thank you again, Jim. I really appreciate the work that you do. I've so enjoyed following your Twitter feed and reading your kidney stories, and again, you and a whole group of other volunteers are patients who are really leading the way, I think, for change. And I think it's long overdue, and I think it's absolutely wonderful. And so I'm trying to do my best and bring my the sort of the transplant nephrology perspective to it. But I certainly, my primary goal is to follow where the patients lead me. I guess the only other sort of medical point I would make is I want to quickly run through some reasons why early transplant preparation is really important. I'm going to just give them, if I got 30 seconds, I'm going to go through 6 or 7 reasons. One,
great.
Transplant centers are more likely to list patients who have not started dialysis because they don't want to deprive them of that pre-transplant listing time. 2, patients are more likely to qualify for listing before the physical and emotional toll of dialysis. So if you get early to the transplant center, you're more likely to get on the list. 3rd is that patients who are listed before dialysis have a longer so-called estimated post-transplant survival. And that means they're more likely to qualify for 25% more kidneys, which are often the best quality kidneys. Jesse Scholl from the Cleveland Clinic just published a paper about this within the last couple of months. It's really an important finding. And it's one of the reasons why we have inequity in kidney transplant, because people are being referred late and they're not getting that early high EPTS, low, high quality kidney. Early transplant listing reduces the amount of time patients spend on dialysis. We talked about that. Identifying a compatible donor is easier. HLA sensitization becomes more frequent the longer you're on dialysis. So that is a problem that can be avoided. If you start earlier, you have more time for a living donor search. And lastly, this is the seventh reason. If you start earlier, you have more time to address barriers. And those barriers might apply to the recipient. They may apply to the donor. Overweight and smoking are common barriers. Earlier starts helps you get on top of all those problems.
Great. Thank you so much for talking to us and educating us tonight, Doc. What a great interview. I really appreciate you coming on and giving us this opportunity to have this conversation. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Jim. I'm really grateful for the opportunity.
Wonderful. Ladies and gentlemen, watch this space. Next week, we have the baseball card guy on with his wife, and they have news. So it'll be an interesting talk then, too. Dr. Elliot Haher from Square Knot, Inc. Keep him in mind if you're interested in preemptive transplant. Everybody have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Know that they fly, know that they ride or die. I keep Wales by my side, CJ Ike. Now I gotta roll with ice. Cold, these brothers my guys. Know that they fly, know that they ride or die. I keep Wales by my side, CJ Ike. Now I gotta roll with ice. Ride or die, 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 ride or die. Cold, these brothers my guys. Know that they fly, know that they ride or die. I keep Wales by my side, CJ Ike. Now I gotta ride or die.